It's been doom and gloom in May of 2023 as the US deficit gets to the highest that it's ever been, almost forcing the government to shut down. And it's the financial edition, and it's time to read the news. Biden signs the debt ceiling bill that pulls US back from brink of unprecedented default. With just 2 days to spare, President Joe Biden signed legislation on Saturday that lifts the nation's debt ceiling, averting an unprecedented default on the federal government's debt. Now, first off, when they say just 2 days to spare, they are basing that off an estimation from Janet Yellen, who is the chair of the Secretary of Treasury. So it's just an assumption, but it's dramatic, and it's very dramatic because why not? There is a chance that the United States government could, in fact, default at some point down the line. Now, scrolling down, we have Biden who says, no matter how tough our politics get, we need to see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans. So I have a lot of thoughts on this. The main one is that the United States seems very happy to continue to spend into a deficit, but I'll get there in a little bit later. The final agreement passed by the House on Wednesday and the Senate on Thursday suspends the debt limit until 2025 after the next presidential election. Okay, so here's where I take that. What this means is next year, we may see a couple presidential hopefuls who are asked maybe one question about the national deficit, and no matter what they are answering, it won't really matter to them because they can focus on winning the election, and then the national deficit can be a priority the following year. And so it's not really going to matter for 2024 whether or not we continue spending into the deficit. It doesn't really matter because we're going to get to 2025 and then we'll remember it's a big issue that's coming for us in time. So it says here, it gives the lawmakers budget targets for the next 2 years in hopes of assuring fiscal stability as the political season heats up. And by assuring fiscal stability, they're saying assuring the United States taxpayers and business lobbyists, whatever, anyone who's spending money in stock markets, they want to ensure people that they are in fact keeping your money at the forefront of their minds, making sure that interest prices don't go up very high, even though they're already pretty high right now. It says raising the nation's debt limit now at $31.4 trillion will ensure that the government can borrow to pay debts already incurred. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, skipping all the way to the bottom, it says the agreement imposes an automatic overall 1% cut to spending measures if Congress fails to approve its annual spending bills, a measure designed to pressure lawmakers of both parties to reach consensus before the end of the fiscal year in September. In other words, if they don't manage to pass a bill by September, they all lose 1% of their budget. I don't know about you, but if I lost 1% of my budget, I don't think I would have that big of a problem with it. So if we're talking about big hammers, this is not a big hammer. 1% of cuts doesn't nearly hit where it would if they defaulted and had to shut down the government for a while. And here's where we get to the crux of it. In both chambers, more Democrats backed the legislation than Republicans, but both parties were critical to its passage. In the Senate, the tally was 63-36, including 46 Democrats and independents and 17 Republicans in favor. 31 Republicans, along with 4 Democrats and 1 independent who caucuses with the Democrats, opposed. The vote in the House was 314 to 117. What this means is that the United States has lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans who are perfectly happy to talk about how bad overspending is, and then when they need to, they'll come together and pass a spending bill that allows them to continue spending into the deficit. And now I'm going to introduce you to who this impacts the most. This is my son. And my son represents all of the children born at year 2000 on who are going to become responsible for our current economic situation, which of course by then will be like what? Another 10, 20, 50 trillion dollars above where it is now? So we grew up talking about the environment, the global environment, which is obviously very important. And my son and all of your kids are going to be talking about the global environment, plus all of the national deficit the United States has created. And there you have it, out of my literal son's mouth. So here we have the Congressional Budget Office, which is cbo.gov. The federal deficit in 2022 was 1.4 trillion, equal to 5.5% of gross domestic product, almost 2% points greater than the average over the past 50 years. Now there's one really important point here, which is that overall we have a budget of 6.3 trillion and our revenue in the same year was 4.9 trillion, which is extremely high, like unavoidably extremely high. We are spending more money than we have coming in. That is just how it is. Now, here's a really fun project. If you look up us.abalancingact.com, you can take a stab at what it would be like to balance the budget. Now, the reason why I say that Democrats and Republicans are perfectly happy to come together to continue spending money is because when you look here, you see that there's a lot of spending. And the different sides, different parties who champion that type of spending, they're happy to continue spending in those areas. So the type of spending we're talking about is you have healthcare spending and Social Security spending. Oftentimes you hear Democrats who will say you can't take those away, you can't reduce them. And for good reason. Those are obviously supporting lots of people. And then you have the defense spending, and you're going to hear Republicans say, well, we can't reduce the defense. Okay, all right. And then you have interest. Well, how are you supposed to reduce interest? You kind of have to just pay it. And the list goes on and on and on. And then on the other side, you have expenses. You have taxes. And on these taxes, you have top 1%, higher income, all the way down to lower income. So you could increase the taxes overall. You could try reducing the deficit by increasing taxes, but that's where it gets hard, even harder than cutting spending. Because on both sides of the aisle, on both sides, whether it's revenue or expenses, you are hurting someone. On the spending side, we're talking about people who get money and people who receive a paycheck. And on the revenue side, you have people who you're going to take money from their paychecks. It's just not an easy system. So that brings us to what can you do? Because obviously most of us are not in the House or the Senate, and we never will be. And so the best thing that you can do is get your house financially in order. I know, that could mean a lot of different things and only impact so much because you don't have control over what the country does or what the world does. But hear me out. So what I'm talking about here is making sure that you do not overspend. Oftentimes people talk about having a budget. I know, crazy. I know. But it's very helpful. If you can break it down, it can be very simple. It could be 50% is needs, 30% is wants, and 20% is investments. And if you follow Dave Ramsey, he'll suggest that you take 15% of your money and you put it straight into retirement. Those are some really good baselines. The next really good baseline is to make sure you have 3 to 6 months, maybe more, of expenses set aside as an emergency fund. If we have a situation where there's huge financial turmoil, which we've seen, such as in 2020, or any major recession, you're going to want to have money sitting aside just in case you have a big rainy day or a job loss, or if the price of items just goes up astronomically. You're going to want to be able to have enough money set aside to handle that. Third, at some point, it would be worth considering to buy a home. I know that sounds a little crazy given right now we have 6 and 7% interest rates, but the reality is if you were to purchase a house and be very reasonable, buy within your means, ideally you'd have a 20% down payment, but that may or may not be possible. You could hedge your bets that you would be able to secure an interest rate loan that gets lower over time and you could refinance. But if you were facing economic uncertainty, there may be an increase in interest rates. People in their late 20s, such as myself, we never knew a time where interest rates were super duper high. But our grandparents and our great grandparents, they absolutely saw times of high interest. And so it's important to make sure that you reduce your risk over time. And the best way you can do that is by having a budget, not overspending, making sure that you invest, making sure that you have a 3 to 6 month emergency fund, and if possible, try to make sure that your housing costs are stable. Thank you so much for tuning in, and this is the Financial Edition, and have a great evening. Good night. Yeah, buddy. He's a fan of the table. He's not a fan of national deficits. Are you, buddy?